So the first market trend I want to revisit maybe is a lot of what Tom, and I've even used his slides, what he talked about yesterday with some of how AI, he talked about use cases where you could use AI in your business. I want to talk a little bit about how AI is changing that automation market and really the RPA market. So, to revisit this trend, this part, the mailroom sorting, you outsource this, you might buy some hardware, get some actual physical hardware robots like to do mail sorting or something in your mailroom. It's not a really good trend. But at the end of that, what do you have? You have scanned PDFs of some sort. You also get emails at the bottom, extracting invoices from emails at the bottom that give you PDFs. And the result of that is you've got, as Tom said yesterday, this part at the end where you're pulling invoices off emails with a robot, and you've got this part at the end where you have structured data that a robot can easily type into the machine. In many cases, you have human beings doing these steps today, so these are awesome use cases for RPA. They have really quick development times. They're really fast to implement and to get started on. In the middle, you have these two steps, which Tom went into a lot of detail yesterday on, around taking the document, the PDF, finding the line items, extracting the data out of the line items, and then sort of looking up and reasoning about applying logic to that to figure out, actually, now that I have all this data, how do I type it into my invoice system? How do I enter it into the invoice system? And I would have said that the solutions for this, if you look at the broad context of the solution of 3-5 years ago, you would have been buying hardware. You would have had to get bespoke, right? Buy things like data cap, write custom templates for each invoice type. There would have been a lot of bespoke coding and a lot of sort of very specific scanning and technology. This would have been a big investment for your business to do this, to connect these two pieces. And what's interesting about the way the AI is coming into the task management, this part of the market, is you can buy services which do this off Amazon, off Azure. You can buy technologies from the RPA vendors like UiPath and AA, which will do this at a price per page. No upfront investment. You have to train it. There's investment in training it. There's development cost. But actually, the problem has been simplified down. The entry point to get started isn't, I need to buy an enterprise software, I need to buy special hardware to run it, and maybe special hardware to do the scanning. It's coming down to, it's an API call. I hand the API my PDF, and it hands me back structured data. And I pay per page I put through that system. And that is the same as when cloud came into data centers and hardware. It's completely transforming the way the cost point, the entry point, the price points. And what it's really doing, as far as the market trends go, is it's taking a bit of what we used to see as decision automation, and it's moving it all the way back into the task automation category. It's expanding what the addressable market for task automations are, and it's to include those types of use cases. It might not seem as if reading an invoice, as Tom said yesterday, is something you need a human being to do, but actually there's a lot of judgment in it until you get the technology and everything else around that. Being able to do that with a pricing model, it's a per-page pricing model. This is just one example of how AI is coming into this whole automation space and changing the edges to all these boxes, changing the way the market is working today. The second trend I'd say is that task automation is getting more inclusive. So what you're looking at today, this is an actual BACS process we used for a consulting model. So BACS is electronic payment. It's from a shared service center, a financial shared service center engagement. The use case was really around regional and divisional managers would fill in a form on their intranet requesting a BACS payment. It would confirm that they were who they said they were with their logins, and then that would get picked up in the shared service center in these front green boxes at the beginning of it. Someone in the shared service center would pick up the request, read it, do a bunch of research, check to make sure all the compliance checks were there, the bank checks were there, make sure that some regional manager wasn't just paying for his boiler to be fixed, right? That this was an actual supplier for the company, that it matched an actual invoice. and then at the end, and then there's a bit in the middle where there's all of these yellow up and down lines in the flow chart, and that's basically after all the data has been gathered for the compliance check. It off. So there's a 4I rule. Not one person can't approve it. You have to go to a second person as well to check it. If there's certain characteristics or certain suppliers, then we have to check with other people as well. So there's this middle yellow box bit, and at the end there's a second green box where it's passed all the compliance checks. Now we go into some systems, we rekey some data, and we move the money, and we push send, and we're done. And really, in this process flow, again, the beginning and the end of this process are absolutely fantastic use cases for RPA. You get data. In this case, we were getting data electronically. It was in a structured format. It was data that the robot could very easily pick up. It could identify the customer number. It could look up, go into all these different systems, pull these records out, gather it together into an elegant file that was easy to perform compliance checks against. And then there was this middle step, and that's why it's in green. In the end, it was easy to do the payment. This middle step, which was yellow, because our advice to the customer was this middle bit you're going to need a flow engine for of some sort. We need to hand this work off. Their particular compliance and audit function required that a human being, that actually two human beings, reviewed and signed off each of these tests. So this wasn't something we could automate. Obviously, using some sort of decision automation to skip this step would have been an option. It wasn't in this case. So it was a yellow. We're not sure if this is worth automating. It's an amber on your red, amber, green. Is it a good use case? But if we look at today, the major RPA vendors all have human-in-the-loop technology. They all have inboxes and forms which you can embed in the system that will allow you to send that approval off to a being and have the human work together with the robot, right? So the robot does a bit of work, gathers everything together, hands it to a human. The human can hand it to another human, and they can push the approval button. And when the approval buttons are met, they can hand it back to a robot who will complete the work or finish off the task. This type of work isn't capable of handling an entire value stream. It's not a replacement for owning a ticketing system in your shared service center. It's not a replacement for a workflow or a case management system. What it is really useful for is instances like this, where you have a single worker who, where there's some human judgment, some human handoffs in the middle of it, and you need to take that task and hand it off. So it expands that task automation to not just be what one person can do in one sitting, but maybe what one person can do in one sitting, and include him asking the guy next to him to help him with the job to finish it. But that's still a pretty big expansion. And if you reason about the market, the same with AI, those types of technology advances where we see task vendors now, the RPA vendors now, including some process orchestration, some ability to forms for the humans and the robots to interact and talk to each other in more elegant and sophisticated manners. What that's really doing is taking some of the use cases where you might have had to hand off and get to a flow use case and hand it back to the task box. Again, sort of expanding what's possible to solve in the RPA or the task market. These are both really early developments as far as market adoption and how broadly we see them in the market. So, by no means is this the most common, are these last two use cases, I would say, common in the RPA market today. But they're use cases which increasingly we see being adopted, being implemented, right? They went from being, 90% of the people wouldn't ever dream of using RPA for any of those use cases to now probably about half of our customers are looking at or trying or having a go at these kinds of use cases. And so both of those two trends that I've just talked about, both using, taking data out of unstructured structured documents and as part of a flow, and putting humans in the loop to work together with robot. After the customer panel, we'll come back. One of my colleagues, Dan Seeger, will actually show you some of that in action so you can get a sense of the art of the possible around it. And I think the last trend that's worth talking about is where RPA fits in the system. I mean, there's some things I've already mentioned. We see RPA working at much in new verticals that never adopted workflow engines or decision engines in any great with widely in their industry. We also see smaller businesses adopting RPA. The cost point, the entry point is lower, so that allows it it makes it more accessible to a much broader community. We certainly, I mean, this is interesting. It comes from a really prominent information studies academic conference in Europe, RISI. The guy on the side there, Haji Riders, is actually on Twitter as Prof BPM. He is one of the founding fathers of process mining. So he wrote some of the algorithms that people use if you are a process mining aficionado. And yeah, his claim here with how RPA is changing the world is the power of RPA is allows people to automate their own work. And I would say this kind of using RPA as low code, we certainly see that in small implementations. At scale, we see it with in limited governed frameworks. If you want to use RPA at a large scale, you still need a software development mentality towards it today. You still need to write the governance controls around it. You still need to do all of those elements. Where I think he's probably a little bit of a hyperbole, the way the academic community is embracing RPA and viewing it as like this democratization of the future of work. But what is true, I think, inside this is that because RPA is accessing and accessing the systems, doing the work exactly the way the users do in the shared service center, it means those users in the shared service center can sit with the developer and really understand and work together to collaborate on, this is how we should solve this use case. The number of times that we go into a customer and the person who solves, we have RPA, we're struggling to screen scrape a screen or interact with during one workflow, the happy path of the RPA automation. But the person who solves the problem for us is not normally the SAP developer or the ERP developer who's working on the system. The person who solves it for us is the guy in the shared service center who does this job every day. Because he's the guy who says, well, actually, there's another screen which does the same thing. Should we see if we can automate on that screen instead of this screen? They're the people, the business users are the people who know how the user interface works, where the different elements are, where the different places he can go to find this information, and how the systems work. It's those business SMEs who are increasingly involved in and empowered by this type of automation. And that is changing because that means that people are bringing business budgets to buy RPA solutions, not just IT budgets. And a lot of times, of all the automation tech, RPA is the one that is most commonly bought with business budget. To be successful, you still want to have IT at the table, for sure. But it's an interesting trend that it's starting to lean more towards that business enablement, business empowerment place. Much more so than a lot of the other technologies we've seen, we work in and you see across the automation space. So that's sort of three trends we see, where the market kind of is, both the narrow RPA market. Certainly, I mean, 5 years ago, we would have called RPA a niche technology in automation. And now I think, we need to start thinking about it as being a common component for enterprise architectures or organizations. But RPA is only a part of that broader spectrum. So I've tried today to maybe show you where the current state of that spectrum is, how to think about that full automation market, and also to think about how the technology changes in AI, in flow technology and RPA technology are really putting pressure on changing the way the lines are blurred or lines are drawn.